Thank you everyone for coming to today's UCL Lunchtime Lecture. My name is Ilan Kelman. I'm an academic staff member here at UCL at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and the Institute for Global Health. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor David Alexander, also at the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, who is known around the world in multiple academic fields, all of them rather morbid. His career spans 4 countries and 2 continents, which includes several hundred publications, including 24 books across 2 languages, all the while teaching 3 modules on our Thriving Master's program. So he's basically a standard UCL underachiever. Since it is his birthday tomorrow, we have the privilege of welcoming him on his last day of youthful exuberance. So, Professor David Alexander.
Thank you so much. And it is, thank you. I was looking on the news and it said, International Women's Day, what are your plans? Oh, damn it, I'm going to take the day off. It's my birthday after all. But some would say it's poetic justice that I was born on International Women's Day. Anyway, there you are. You go to a cocktail party and somebody says, well, what do you do for a living? You say, oh, I'm a disasterologist. Oh, they take a step back, you know. Anyway, disaster, what does it mean to you? What does it mean at all? It has many different meanings. What we're going to look at is the discrepancy between popular culture ideas of disaster and what it's actually really like when you're there. Now, Bernard Kowalski, the great film director, made a film called Krakatoa East of Java in 1969. His other great magnum opus was The Attack of the Giant Leeches. So I think that gives you some idea of what sort of a film director he was. But can someone tell me what's wrong with Krakatoa East of Java? Exactly. Krakatau or Krakatoa is west of Java. Now, that doesn't say much for Hollywood's geography, does it? Of course, we've recently had the eruption of Anak Krakatau, or son of Krakatau, along with another tsunami. The film is about the eruption of 1883, which produced a 40-meter tsunami and killed 36,000 people. Right, so Hollywood and its disaster movies. Really, when they made Stonados, I'm not quite sure what they were taking. Class A substance, almost certainly. But there we go. Well, out of all of these, actually my favorite is Dante's Peak. And the reason for that is it includes 5 incompatible kinds of volcanic eruption and just about every single sociological mistake in the book of disaster sociology. So, as Jean-Luc Godard said, in a slightly more refined context, perhaps, cinema is the most beautiful fraud in the world. The trouble is, though, that very many popular attitudes to things like disaster are actually conditioned by things like this. And there is a sort of Hollywood model in all of this, the Hollywood model. Disasters cause the order of society to break down. And as it does so, inside of us, there is a savage waiting to get out, and disaster liberates the savage. Actually, I think I might have got things a bit wrong here. I didn't mean to imply that all hunter-gatherers are savages. Are there any hunter-gatherers in the room today? No? Well, I expect there will be after Brexit. Anyway, right, the savage waiting. Are there any savages in the room? Well, no, don't answer that. No, we'll leave that one. But anyway, the harsh reality of disaster is a wee bit different. Clearly, damage, destruction, suffering, death, injury, and so on. Unpleasant truths about preparedness. For example, if you look at the picture there, that comes from Hurricane Haiyan, known locally as Cyclone Yolanda in the Philippines, and that's the beach at Tacloban. And I had the distinct impression that they made the concrete for the houses out of Quaker oats. At least that's more or less how it behaved. It would hardly have behaved differently if they had, which is not a good situation vulnerability-wise. Anyway, unpleasant truths about preparedness are one thing. Power politics go into action. So much of what really happens in disaster is attributable to the way that power politics play out, actually. Wealth differentials are shown up in high relief. The wealthy are not so substantially affected as the poor in just about every case. And are disasters exceptional events? Well, I suppose if you are in one, they are. But let's bear in mind that there's an average of about 2 disasters a day around the world. In other words, roughly 700 a year. It varies. The frequency is rather spiky. And also the definition is rather difficult. But I would say it's pretty much a robust generalization to say that we have an average of about 700 disasters a year. They, therefore, are everyday events in quite the literal sense. If you look at a typical map of disasters at any point in time, a world map, you'll see about 20 of them in early stages here, there, and wherever around the world. And what really is fascinating about them is that they open up a window on the inner workings of society where we can see what's really going on in society. That can be a very sobering experience in many cases, but it's also highly instructive, and on occasion, it's also inspiring. But anyway, there can be some bizarre moments, and here is one of them. The house didn't survive, but the radiator did. Really rather weird, that, and that I suppose shows that in seismic zones you should not chase the wall and put the radiator pipes in it because it weakens it to the point where it might collapse, even if your radiator is thoroughly robust. But anyway, now, I hope you've perhaps had a copy of the questionnaire and maybe filled in a few details on it. If you care to do so, we'll put the results on our blog site in our institute. But anyway, we'll collect that in at the end if we may, if you wish to participate. But I've done this in the past, and also I've spent a lot of time considering what are the common misconceptions about disaster. I reviewed all of that this morning and managed to get the number up to 63 common misconceptions. I'm sure if we really worked at it, we could get to 100, but that's the goal, basically. And all that's on my blog site, where I put a new version of it on with the latest additions. I also once did some actual serious research about it that came out in the rather wide-ranging journal Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine in 2007. But let's look at one or two of the common misconceptions about disaster and see what they are. Now, many of us in this field don't like the term natural disaster at all. Personally, I love it, not the least because I wrote a book with that title 25 years ago and it's still in print, which is something of a miracle in this day and age. But anyway, apart from that, the idea is, of course, that disasters are in no way natural. Well, all I can say to that is there's nothing more natural than errant human behavior. So that's why I still like the term. But the truth of the matter is that disasters are almost always the result, really not so much of extremes of natural events, but of the way that people and communities make themselves vulnerable or become vulnerable or are vulnerable. So there's nothing necessarily inevitable, and there's nothing terribly natural about that, except that perhaps it's part of a natural part of the human condition. Another common misconception is that we measure earthquake magnitude on the Richter scale. Well, we did once, but the problem with that is that it is a thoroughly inaccurate means of measuring the force liberated by an earthquake, the energy surrogate for the energy involved in an earthquake, and so we have better and more accurate measures, particularly so-called moment magnitude or body wave magnitude, especially for larger earthquakes that the Richter magnitude fails to characterize adequately. Charles F. Richter of Caltech was an interesting character. He didn't have a sense of humor, and so when his students produced a song for the Christmas party called The Richter Scale, he was not amused. He was a convinced nudist. When summertime came around, he went to the beach. He can't have been easy to live with because his wife went to the mountains. But anyway, Charles Richter for you. Another myth, another misassumption. I've called them myths. They're not really myths. They're sort of statistical improbabilities is a proper way to call them, but that took up too much space on the slide. Anyway, behavior of animals can predict earthquakes. Well, possibly, but out of about 8 or 9 different earthquake precursors, and here we're talking about short-term prediction, the behavior of animals is decidedly the least reliable. And it may have something to do with understanding animal psychology in the face of abnormal physical signals that they pick up and we don't. However, we have a series of other means of assessing what's going on, which are associated with geophysics in its various forms, the atmosphere, the Earth's crust, and so on, and they are far more reliable, even though short-term earthquake prediction is still a bit of a mirage. Tsunamis are tidal waves. I insist on calling them tidal waves, but in reality, tidal waves are a very different sort of bore. And tsunamis have a completely different sort of mechanism that sets them going, which involves the movement of an entire column of water and the propagation outwards of an elliptical movement as energy diffuses from the source. So they're not tidal waves at all, even though we can use tide gauges in harbour to measure water level in association with arriving tsunamis. Part of my research at the moment involves the remote but not impossible likelihood that actually the River Thames might see a tsunami, and that tsunami might be in flames. Now, it is a curious fact that there have been quite a lot of tsunamis that have caught fire. And that's not perhaps what you might expect. So can you imagine something like this, which is from Japan 2011, coming up the River Thames? Well, it is not impossible. I admit it's highly unlikely, but there are reasons why that is feasible. Anyway, disasters do cause a great deal of chaos and destruction and so on. That doesn't mean that they can't be examined systematically and managed likewise, because we now have 101 years worth of study, of which the last 50 or so have been quite intensive study. When I started 39 years ago, few people were involved in disaster. If you said you were as an academic, they laughed at you. But now it is a very broad, very well-frequented field with institutes, departments, and universities studying it all over the world quite intensively. And so we have the means to manage the event and the risk and the vulnerability. Vulnerability. Disasters kill people without respect to social class. You know, they kill across the board, true or false? Well, false, really. It's the poor and marginalized who suffer the most. For example, in the Nicaragua earthquake of 1972, the middle class managed to rebuild in 6 months. The upper class grabbed the gold, got in the helicopter and left. And some of the lower classes never rebuilt since then. We're looking, by the way, again at the Philippines and a sports stadium that collapsed, and yet there's still somebody living in it. And if you look above the door, you can see a lump of concrete, which is simply dangling there above the front door. Well, vulnerability in the raw. Misassumption: significant number of people can survive for days under the rubble when buildings collapse. Now, you hear a lot about miracle salvations when you get things like earthquakes or possibly hurricanes and so on. Somebody dragged out of the rubble after 2 weeks. Yes, that is possible, but actually very little in the search and rescue field goes on after about 12 hours. For example, in the Haiti earthquake, where X number of people died, how many died? Well, we don't know. They weren't counted. Some say 90,000, some say 240,000. But anyway, in terms of saving lives, search and rescue managed to save 139 people. Also, we don't know how many were injured. And after day 5, 9 people were saved. I've got their names and addresses. 9 people were saved at an average cost of about $1 million per life. Curious fact of international humanitarian relief, and particularly the urgent search and rescue side of it. Well, in the Haiti earthquake, a colleague wrote an open letter: "Thank you, Mr. President, for being so quick to respond to the Haiti earthquake." And we all thought, ah, yes, Obama, he was there in heart and spirit. Well, no, He was the president of Iceland. Iceland, the first country to respond to the Haiti earthquake. That is preposterous, but it is somewhat typical of the international relief system, I fear. Right, but the biggest misassumption of all, and the most enduring one, concerns panic as a common reaction. People will panic, or people are panicking, or have panicked. The reality of it, according to sociologists, and we have now about 70 years of study of this, is that by and large people behave rationally. If panic does occur, it's a spontaneous and very short-lived reaction to a fear of entrapment. Now, it might not actually be entrapment, but it's certainly a fear of being trapped. And that doesn't occur very often, to be honest. So, in fact, if people run away, they run away. That may, in fact, be a very rational response. It may even be a response that is thought out properly. For example, we have photographs of people running away from the collapse of the World Trade Center. Well, you wouldn't stand around and bask in the glory of a 110-story building collapsing in front of your face. Although the fact that we have photographs indicates that some people turned around and photographed it as they ran. So there you go. Norris Johnson, an eminent US sociologist, when he was president of the American Sociological Association, gave a presidential address entitled The Myth of Panic. I think he was going too far, perhaps by a long way, but panic is very, very much overestimated. When you see a chaotic situation, it does not automatically denote panic. And people do not necessarily flee in large numbers from disaster areas either. By and large, the opposite is true. They fill up. I can recall one case of a flash flood in a mountain area. Not only were the skies thronged with helicopters and the streets thronged with emergency vehicles, but after a while, you started to get coachloads of tourists arriving as well. And as far as I know, no one from the local area left it. After disaster, survivors are dazed, apathetic. They sit around waiting to be rescued and helped and so on. Or do they? Well, there used to be in the 50s an idea or two about this, which suggested that there was a thing called the disaster syndrome, a sort of symbolic end of the world. And in the worst possible case, you might find a third of people who've been directly and very severely affected, but not killed or injured to the point they were in a coma, might suffer from it. That has been sort of debunked ever since, and it is now really quite improbable that even as many as half of that 15% of people very directly affected would in any way be dazed and apathetic. Indeed, I would say it's probably improbable that 5% would be in that condition. They help themselves and they help others above all. And that gives us what Alan Barton, Canadian sociologist, called the therapeutic community. Usually after disaster, the first assistance is provided by emergency services, or is it? Well, it tends to be the people who are there in their shorts and flip-flops and T-shirts and so on, the neighbours, the family, passers-by or whoever. Look at the photograph. It shows a young boy rescued from the ruins of an earthquake in Bangladesh, and he returns to good health, happily, but who's rescuing him? The neighbours. And that is so often the case for the simple reason that they are there and the emergency services take time, sometimes excruciatingly long periods of time, to arrive. People won't make rational decisions after disaster and therefore will do the wrong thing unless they're properly guided. Well, maybe, but by and large, people assess the situation and they decide according to their own idea of what is rational. Now, the trouble with that is it does appear to me after 39 years of studying these things that there is an innumerable number of rationalities. For example, take the paradoxical case of the tourists who take their clothes off on top of the Malaysian mountain, and then there are 36 dead in an earthquake, and a cabinet minister of Malaysia said it was because the tourists angered the god of the mountain. Well, all right, as scientists, we might pour scorn upon that idea, but the fact is, it is there as a solid fact that a person of importance looked to by the community said it, and people believe it. And the mere fact that something is believed means that it has an impact and an effect, and also that it could be studied from the point of view of academic approaches. Anyway, disasters give rise to widespread spontaneous manifestations of antisocial behaviour, and that's Hollywood to a T, absolute to a T. There they are, they dash about, and violence spreads like wildfire, they shoot at each other and all the rest of it. You see it in innumerable movies. The reality is that by and large, at least for a short period, we get generosity, self-sacrifice, and Barton's therapeutic community. Now, it isn't absolutely universal. It doesn't mean that criminals disappear completely and that pre-existing conflicts are totally shelved, although on occasion they are, and quite often they are bait for the period of the emergency. Looting is a common and serious problem. Well, I felt I had to put a picture of looting. It's the only one I've ever taken, actually, and it was one instance. And yes, looting does occur. It is very much a statistical regularity to say that looting is rare and limited. The point being that you can't expect that just because there is a disaster, in this case a major earthquake, that the criminal elements from society will simply disappear. But by and large, there is more social control and more social surveillance in disaster as people are looking after each other rather more, and that limits the scope for looting. But when the mass media get hold of it, they are capable of turning one looter into a whole army of people chipping away at the fabric of society. In disaster, people resort to violence to protect their interests. Well, by and large, that also isn't true. Now, of course, there may be cases of it, but I would say they would have to be instances where there is very strong pre-existing conflict. And there aren't necessarily very many of those, except in what are sometimes known as complex emergencies. But let's not go too far into that because time is limited. Unburied dead bodies constitute a health hazard. Well, now that is very often said, and it very often is said that unburied dead bodies will give rise to epidemics. In the Haiti earthquake, where there were great courtyards full 2 meters high with unburied dead bodies, I was going to put pictures in and I thought better of it. And what happened? Well, there weren't any epidemics due to that. The World Health Organization and the Red Cross Federation banded together to debunk the idea that that would cause epidemics. So what happened? Well, an article appeared in the Daily Mail saying that there were going to be epidemics because they hadn't buried the dead bodies. But there you are. What it has led to is burying bodies in great haste. In some tropical areas, it's meant that they've dug the trench, flung the bodies in. The trench has filled up with water if it happens to be a wet tropical area, and the bodies have floated out. And that does wonders for the survivors who are grieving and so on. Also, without a death certificate, all sorts of important things don't happen, such as transferable pensions and so on. So there are very good reasons for not burying dead bodies by simply throwing them into a trench, and that's that. Having said that, there are cultural reasons for doing it, which is why it's happening in the instance in the picture. Disease epidemics are an almost inevitable result of disruption of healthcare and the spread of germs and bacteria and viruses and so on. Well, put it this way, the Centers for Disease Control, Atlanta, Georgia, did a study of 1,000 disasters and found that they were connected with the epidemics in 8 cases, except that in all 8 cases, these were seasonal variations in the disease in question, things like malaria, encephalitis, and so on, which were endemic in the areas in question, and there might just as well have been epidemics even without the disaster. What really happens, though, instead, is that epidemiological surveillance goes up like a rocket. Doctors converge on the area, the diagnosis rate goes off the scale, and that can sometimes give the impression that you've got an epidemic, even when all it's doing is diagnosing a standard rate of what you would expect in the area anyway. Dead bodies, survivors, streets and rubble need to be sprayed with disinfectant to stop the spread of disease. Well, it happened to me once. I was eating a plate of rigatoni with tomato sauce, on top of which there was Parmesan cheese and formaldehyde. Great. It really didn't taste too good at all. But the reality of it is that when that is done, it merely wastes disinfectant in large quantities without doing anything whatsoever for public health, although it looks good. it looks good because you're doing something, this motorized spray, all of this, the fumes and the liquids and so on all over the place. One should donate used clothes to the victims of disaster. Well, it may be that they have a need of clothing, but if they do, it will be rather specific. But what we've often had is huge quantities of useless garments, including things like dinner jackets, bikinis, and high-heeled shoes. So we hope that when this lot here open their packages, they at least will find something they can wear, whether or not they want to wear it. I can recall one instance where 4 big trucks from the United Colours of Benetton turned up. Locals didn't want them. They wanted not United Colours, but black. They were in mourning. Companies, corporations, associations, etc., are always very generous when they send aid and relief. Well, look at it this way. For example, in the Armenian earthquake of 1988, 500 tons of medicine turned up. It took 28 days to figure out what they were, and that 16% of them had long passed their use-by dates. And it was then discovered that virtually none of them at all were of any use whatsoever with respect to the pathologies that existed in the earthquake zone. And that is very common. Baroness de Souza, with whom I've worked in the past and has a background in this field, once told me that when she was in Guatemala City in 1976, there were big crates of medicine there marked not to be used after August 1934. Not nice, dumping grounds. And that really is rather the dark side of humanity when it happens. Donations in kind are safer and better than cash grants. Well, they might be, if it's the right thing, if it's what people really genuinely need. But by and large, cash is more flexible, and it doesn't necessarily get spent in firewater or go straight into the pockets of the mafia or something like that. Perhaps the biggest drawback of cash is that it tends to stimulate local inflation a bit, although not necessarily in any way that cripples the initiative. Aid always benefits the recipients and not the donors. Well, they're very interesting, very thorough analysis of Live Aid and Band Aid that tended to suggest they did more harm than good, actually, in Ethiopia. Interesting. But further analysis of the Haiti earthquake showed that about 80% of what was donated cycled back to the donor countries. For example, if you provide shelter, it was made in rich countries, it was transported by rich countries, it was assembled by rich countries, and the profits and the cost thereof went back to rich countries. And that's something we might think rather deeply about. Technology will save the world from disaster. Well, it might do, and there are a lot of people working on that now. But unfortunately, technology is very much a double-edged sword. The reality is that the problem of disasters is a largely social one. Technology has both beneficial effects, but it also can create the disaster. We have things called NATEX, natural technological, where the natural hazard acts upon the technological fixtures, and that really is the source of the disaster. So the reality is that technology is constantly reducing as it increases vulnerability to disaster. But there you go. Technology is a wonderful, many-faceted thing. Knowledge leads to action. Now, there are periodically meetings of UN agencies where we try to get the world to take up science and to use it for the benefit of humanity, because we do know the solutions to a lot of disaster problems. But there is often a reluctance to use the solutions, and the reasons for that are purely political. In other words, you can supply the evidence, but it is utterly naive to think that those who would benefit from the evidence will use it, namely the politicians. They may or they may not, but you have to look at it from their point of view and see whether it's convenient to them to use the knowledge or not. And that is an entirely different matter. So we draw close to the end of this short survey, but there are many more possible misconceptions. Disasters always happen to someone else. Well, as the survivor of an earthquake, I can tell you that really isn't true. And if you go around and talk to disasterologists here, there, everywhere. You'll find it surprising how many of them got into the field by being in one. And as 2.5 billion people every decade are affected directly by disaster, I suppose that's not surprising in its way. But what you have to avoid is the syndrome of personal vulnerability. Now, I don't want you to go home and not sleep tonight. But nevertheless, do not imagine that disasters are something that does always happen to other people. It is not so. So there we are. Never think outside the box. And if you never think outside the box, you'll never get to grips with some of these factors and features that we've looked at and the other ones that are on the blog site listed there. My last points are about the film The Towering Inferno, typical disaster movie of its kind, rather old, 1974. Actually, I went to the Emergency Planning College a year or two ago, and they gave me a copy of it, which I thought was a bit weird, quite honestly, but I found it quite instructive because at the end of it, the fire chief has a meeting with the architect who designed the building that caught fire, and he says to him, you know, you really ought to start thinking about fire prevention, designing these buildings. And the architect, who uses his head merely as a place to hang his architect's hat, says, yes, I suppose I should. But what is frightening about that is that then we get Grenfell Tower, and suddenly the Towering Inferno becomes not merely a silly, inaccurate film, but actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. I am really surprised that of the news on Grenfell Tower, the official news, virtually none of it at all that's come out has been positive. Perhaps the community news, yes, but the news from official sources, no. And that is something we really should meditate on. So that's it. Come and see us, come and talk to us about disasters if you are particularly interested in them. My current research is on two things: unexploded bombs and PhD examinations. They're very closely related. Anyway, I've now run out of steam, so questions?
Well, thank you so much. We now have the chance to see, are you convinced? Or would you like to question and challenge what you've heard? And we do have microphones, so please raise your hand if you have questions and a microphone will come to you. Otherwise, I have a whole list here and I'm perfectly willing to ask David some questions about the presentation. Please, we have two here, one and then two.
Thank you. I have simple, query, sir. Are these influences consistent or universal in spatio-temporal context?
Well, of the 63 things that I identified in the document as being possible misconceptions, they are fairly universal, but they're very much statistical misconceptions in the sense that you can find examples that contradict what I say here easily enough. It's simply that I think as a statistical generalization, they have some validity. It does vary somewhat. For example, looting, is it not a problem? I think it's a problem where there are preconditions for it, and where such is the fabric of society that sort of breakage in the fabric, which sociologists call the abandonment of property norms, can occur and does occur. But in many instances, in many places, that is highly unlikely, and therefore it doesn't happen. So looting is actually one of the most contentious issues. Sociologists will probably not tell you that it doesn't exist, but they certainly would tell you that it's very uncommon. And that is true in varying degrees for the other generalizations. So there are observations that, yes, you can find here, but perhaps not there, and so on. A lot depends on cultural context as well as socioeconomic context, which of course is highly variable.
I think I've gathered from this that your examples have shown or landed up with some kind of physical damage.
Yes. Something
one can see objectively. But I'm not sure about how the cause and effect works here. Would you consider the financial crisis of maybe starting in 2007-8, a disaster? I mean,
Right.
it does have the social side of things that you were talking about, and the damage is there, but it is maybe quite diffuse and down the line, whereas if you have a tsunami, you can see it. I wonder if you could elaborate that a bit.
Surely, indeed. Now, the late, great Professor Henry Quarantelli of Delaware University instituted 2 books called What is a Disaster and What is a Disaster Volume 2. And I contributed 2 chapters to What is a Disaster Volume 2, which were seriously criticized by other contributors to the volume. Well, we all criticized each other, actually. In other words, we couldn't make up our minds. So that was 2005, and we're still working on it. Volume 3 will come out sooner or later, and it won't solve the problem. And really, we do have that issue of where are the boundaries of what is a disaster. For example, I've had in the last 24 hours debates with people about whether climate change, without explicit reference to extremes, is within our purview as disaster students. And I say no, but mainly on the basis of convenience, because we simply can't afford to study too much. To what extent do we study epidemics? To what extent do we study financial crashes and things like that, socioeconomic things? Well, we do, we don't. It is very difficult because there isn't a clear, rational, absolute boundary to this, plus the fact that these things very often impinge on other things. For example, the economic state of a place may have a great deal to do with how vulnerable it is to more classic forms of disaster. The effect of the crash of 2008 may be felt also in increased suffering among those who have suffered various forms of disaster, whether they be, well, any of the 5 different categories, which are natural hazards, anthropogenic, things like transportation crashes, pollution, and so on, social, which include riots, strikes, crowd crushes, and so on, intentional, terrorism, and the 5th category, any of the above mixed together. So we do have problems with definition, which are interesting and fun to debate, but they somewhat hobble us as we try to make progress.
So as you went through, it just seemed like every single generalization that I understood about disasters turned out to be a myth. Are there any generalizations that aren't a myth?
Yeah, right. The word myth, of course, is wrong, but it just happens to be a 4-letter word, so it's just a convenience. But anyway, vulnerability really is the root of disaster, I would say. I don't think many people would disagree with that. Now, that does depend on how we define and how we characterize vulnerability. But vulnerability explains disaster far better than things like how much the earth shakes or how big the landslide was or how hard the wind blew or anything like that. Suffering is very closely related to vulnerability. We also have a question of, is resilience, the ability to bounce back or bounce forward, actually the opposite of vulnerability? That is occupying us at the moment in specific contexts. I have a student studying it in Indonesia at present. And our conclusion so far is that yes and no, really. It is to an extent, but not completely. In other words, you can be both vulnerable and resilient without necessarily an absolute balance between them. But we need to understand disaster. We need to look for root causes and how they affect peoples and structures and institutions, vulnerability, which is what we do.
Are there certain prevention methods that have excited you in recent years that are new or have a chance of implementation?
There's an awful lot of technological work going on at present on algorithms and optimization in this for reducing vulnerability, for responding to disasters, for all sorts of stuff like that. Will it work? Most of it, I think, won't actually. But what we need is to produce local level, community level ability to get to grips with problems and solve them. Democracy is extremely important to disasters because this is a shared problem that requires a shared solution. And no matter how large a disaster is, for example, the Indian Ocean tsunami, 13 countries, nearly 300 8,000 dead. But it was a problem of fishing villages, tourist resorts, coastal communities. The theatre of operations is local. That's where the vulnerability is, and that's where we need to act. The word community is contentious. Does it really exist? Does it have any meaning? Is it necessarily positive and things like that? Well, we have to get to grips with that, but nevertheless, stuff has to take place. Things have to go on at the local level by democratic sort of participation and sharing the risk in order to reduce the vulnerability, which is a rather vague sort of response to your question, but that's also because there are many local variations.
Okay, we have a final one question and then final question over there.
On the list of questions that you asked, there was one that I denied about more than any other, and that was, should able-bodied adults volunteer their services? And does that just mean that then there's loads of people that everyone has to deal with, and is it better just to leave people to get on with it and just do what you can where you are locally, or should people volunteer and help?
Well, volunteerism is an excellent thing in hazard risk disaster risk reduction, hazard reduction, all of that, responding to emergencies, the lot is a very, very good thing. But we are, the trouble with that is I didn't have much space to explain myself, and therefore I was perhaps a little too vague. But we're out of the age of spontaneous volunteerism and into the age of organised volunteerism. Spontaneous volunteerism does not make good use of people's capabilities. It is not much of a good idea because people lack autonomy, they lack equipment, they lack personal protective gear, and they lack a lot of things. Yes, it can be used for cleaning the streets where there's rubbish all over the place after a storm or something like that. You can get people together on social media and they can all go out with brooms. Fair enough, and that's good in its own right. But really what we need is organised volunteerism where associations of volunteers are made and they are incorporated into the system. For example, in Italy, there are 3,600 civil protection volunteer organisations, 36 of which are federated nationally. They are the system, but they're also the vital connection, along with the fact that mayors of the 8,142 municipalities are elected by the population and are the chief civil protection operative. So those are two direct connections between the system and the people who are the beneficiaries. And if you ask people, what is civil protection? Who is civil protection? Civil protection being disaster response and reduction. The answer should be all of us. We're all civil protection because we all bear some responsibility for the risk, the vulnerability, and the need to be safe.
Okay, final question, please.
Yeah, minor planet impacts on the surface of the Earth.
Yes.
Obviously, there's been some in prehistoric times, and
yes.
Some people think in early historic times, and there's been various lurid movies like Deep Impact and Armageddon, and there's been more discussion of this recently. How sanguine are you about the idea that we will be able at some point not too far away to prevent minor planet impacts? Or will it always be a matter of trying to pick up the pieces?
I would rather, if I may, generalise the question slightly more to include some other very infrequent but enormous impacts, because we could also include volcanic explosivity index 7 volcanic eruptions. Now, these are the kind of volcanic eruptions that could wipe out agriculture in the same way that asteroid impact might do, or to an extent. These things are very infrequent. There really is little we can do to prepare for them at present, and there are many more pressing things we need to prepare for on a more mundane, humdrum, local, everyday level. And that, I think, we have to do. It's not that we shouldn't study these things. For example, space weather is something that we study in IRDR and is very important, but few people know about it. And if you have a space weather incident, very large coalescence of sunspots coming towards the Earth, last major one was 1859. It would be do tremendous damage to satellites, electricity transformers, a great many systems on which we are increasingly dependent, global positioning system, global navigation systems, for example, on which we are increasingly dependent. Is that going to happen? Well, it might do. 2012, one of these just missed. And in the last 20 years, we've had partial encounters of this kind that have knocked out satellites, knocked out GPS, fortunately temporarily, but who knows? So yes, there is a whole range of things. Caldera collapse in the Caribbean leading to a massive tsunami coming towards Europe. Then what? Up the Bristol Channel, goodness knows. Is it likely? Well, you can see in the record, for example, in the Bristol Channel or off the coast of Scotland, there are tsunami deposits, and some of them quite high up when you've made the appropriate adjustments for tectonics. So there have been big tsunamis in the past, and there have been big events of various kinds. Okay, 65 million years since we had an asteroid impact of note, but the trouble is that I think we just have limited resources and we really have to devote them to things that are more common.
That optimistic note,
Yep.
please do hand in your survey so we can compile the data. Help us get to 100 disaster myths, as well as 100 myths which are not actually myths. In this room on Tuesday will be the next UCL lunchtime lecture on Save the Children, containing child obesity from a human evolutionary perspective. And please join me in thanking David Alexander again for today's talk.